Welcome to our second screencast for Chapter 10. Remember that this particular chapter is going to be broken down into only two screencasts, and I think we have 3 slides left on this particular PowerPoint, so I think this screencast is going to be relatively short. Some of the things we want to remember is some of the information that we had looked at last time. We had started talking about classification, and we had 2 different types of classification that we had looked at. We had looked at a type of classification that was called systematics, and the second type of classification was called taxonomy. And the main difference between those two was that systematics was going to emphasize more of an evolutionary type of bend to the classification scheme, while taxonomic classification was going to look more at characteristics between different organisms and place those organisms into groups based on those characteristics. After that, we had looked at a couple of individuals that were pretty instrumental in classification. We had talked about Aristotle and how he was one of the original individuals who had created a way to classify organisms, and we had also talked about Linnaeus. And Linnaeus came up with the 7 different taxa that we would use to classify an organism. And those taxa, of course, were kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And he was also responsible for coming up with the way that we would actually name an organism or name a species. And he came up with that particular method, and it was called binomial nomenclature. All right? And so that's a little bit of a review of what we had looked at in screencast number 1 for Chapter 10. In this screencast, we will be looking at the area of systematics. If you remember back in our first screencast for Chapter 10, we had looked at 2 different types of classification systems. We had looked at systematics, which is a type of classification system that focuses more on the evolutionary aspect of organism development, and the second type of classification was taxonomic classification. And in that type of classification, we would look more at different features or different characters that would be found between different groups of animals. So in this one, what we're going to do is we are going to create something called a phylogenetic tree. So we're going to be looking at phylogeny in the screencast. So phylogeny is based on the study of organismal features or characters that vary among species. And so we're going to look at the groups that we're comparing and look at their form, look at their structure, and basically compare the groups based on that. Now, I had said before that phylogeny tends to fall under the category of systematics. So again, we are going to look at the characters, but we're also going to include some information based on common ancestors. And so that's going to be the evolutionary aspect of this particular screencast. So when we talk about the features that we will compare, we need to understand that we will look at several different types of characteristics. We might look at morphological types of characteristics, which would be those that are like structure and function of the individual. We would look at chromosomal characteristics. We might look at molecular features of those organisms, which might be things like proteins and various other chemicals that would be produced by those organisms. And so we would make comparisons based on those things. When we talk about those characteristics, we actually look at them in 2 ways. The first way that we would look at them would be based on common ancestry. So when you look at the characteristics that take into account this common ancestry, we call those characteristics homologous characteristics. Now, the easiest way to understand this is to look at the diagram on the right-hand side. So if you notice, we have a bird's wing, we have a dolphin's fin, and we have a human arm. So each of these appendages is adapted for a specific environment. Of course, the bird is going to fly, the dolphin is going to swim, and the human arm is basically adapted to grasp and to hold on to things. We would consider these homologous structures. Now they're homologous because we assume that all 3 of them have originated from the same common ancestor. And if we look at the structure for each appendage, you're going to notice the bones that make up these structures are very similar to each other. So the types of bones that we would find in each appendage are pretty much the same. They might have been modified a bit, but they're still the same. And again, that's going to imply common ancestry. Now, if we're looking at a homoplastic type of characteristic, what we're looking at here is we're looking at sort of something that is somewhat similar to homology, but in this case, the similarities that we notice tend to misrepresent common descent. So if you look at the diagram on the right hand side here, so if you look at the bat, and if you look at the bird, and if you look at the insect, all three of them have the ability to fly. And to fly, you have to have wings. And so we see wings in each organism. Now, of course, if you look at the structure of each wing, it's a little bit different, right? And so the way that those wings actually developed was strongly influenced by the environment that they happened to live in. So those would be considered homoplastic. We do not have a common ancestor between these three organisms. So you can't consider these homologous characters. They're only homologous if they have a common ancestor. All right, so these are homoplastic, and these are going to be homologous. Looking at this next slide, you're going to notice we are going to be introducing you to some terms that are really important for us to be able to reconstruct phylogeny. Right? What we need to do is we need to understand these terms to create our evolutionary tree. So the first two that we look at is ancestral, and we look at derived. Now, these two terms refer to characters, so they refer to the features that we would see in the groups that we are comparing. So if it's an ancestral character, it's a character that was present in the common ancestor for all the organisms that we're trying to compare. Now, a good example of this would be the backbone that you see on the right-hand side. If you think about mammals, for example, mammals have a backbone. If you think about birds, birds have a backbone. If you think about fish, fish have a backbone. All right, so that is something that kind of links all three of these together. But if you look at them more closely, they have lots of characteristics that make them very different from each other. Mammals have fur, birds have feathers, fish have scales. And that's a pretty significant difference that separates these three organisms. But they are all connected to some common ancestor, some ancestral trait that groups them together. And so again, that's going to be considered an ancestral type of characteristic. So again, the backbone is ancestral. Now, those characteristics that are considered derived, those are characteristics that arose later in the evolutionary time frame. So again, when we're talking about the fur of the mammals, the feathers of the bird, and the scales of the fish, those would be considered derived characteristics. And again, it helps to separate these groups, helps to separate these organisms, but they're considered derived because they're not common among the three. Now, we often refer to something called an outgroup. Now, this is going to show if a character occurred both within and outside the common ancestor. And we're going to look more at this in the next slide as we go through an example together. So a series of species that share derived characters form a subset called a clade. Now again, you need to get familiar with these terms, and again, we'll look at this in a second on the next slide where I go through an example that will illustrate a clade. So by identifying nested hierarchies of clades or branches of our tree, we can form patterns of common descent. All right, so we can see the connections that we recognize between the groups that we're trying to compare. When you come to class, you will get some practice in creating something called a cladogram. All right? So of course a cladogram is going to be made up of various clades and various branches. All right? And this is going to be considered a nested hierarchy of clades. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about on how to construct a phylogenetic tree, or it's also called a cladogram. So the phylogenetic tree or cladogram that we're referring to is right down here towards the bottom of your screen. So again, this is going to be a cladogram. Now, in order to create our cladogram, what we need to do is we need to make some comparisons based on certain characteristics, and those are going to be located at the very top of our table. So if you notice at the very top, we're organizing our data. All right. So the organisms we look at are going to be lamprey, shark, salamander, lizard, tiger, gorilla, and human. So the intent of our cladogram is to place these organisms in a certain order based on the characteristics that are present. And so if you notice, the characteristics we're looking at are jaws, lungs, amniotic membrane, hair, do they have a tail, and bipedalism. When you look at the lamprey and you look at all these characteristics, you're going to find out that this lamprey does not have any of these characteristics. Now that's what that 0 represents. It basically tells you that characteristic is not present. Now if you look at the shark definitely has jaws, but it does not contain any of the other characteristics that we're comparing. Salamander has jaws, it has lungs, but does not contain any of these characteristics. So we continue doing that until we've compared those characteristics to each of our organisms. So then what we do is we take that information and we create what you see at the bottom. So this is again the phylogenetic tree or cladogram. Now if you notice, we've lined up our organisms on the very top. Now there's a certain order to the way that we put these organisms, and if you notice, it's based on those characteristics and the number of characteristics that they have. Now if you look at the lamprey is kind of special because the lamprey did not have any of these characteristics. And so because the lamprey did not have any of these characteristics, we're going to consider the lamprey the most primitive of all these organisms. And so what they'll often do is designate that most primitive organism as being your outgroup. All right, so it's the most ancestral of the organisms. Now if you notice, we go ahead and create our cladogram and again organize these organisms based on those structures. And so the first structure we look at was jaws. And if you notice, this was the structure that was common amongst most of our organisms. And if you notice, we have ones on down the line. And so this is going to be furthest back. So this was the characteristic that was most common the furthest back in evolutionary history. So the shark has jaws, the salamander, the lizard, the tiger, the gorilla, and the human. Now the next characteristic we look at in terms of evolutionary development is going to be the lungs. The shark does not have lungs, but the salamander, the lizard, the tiger, the gorilla, and the human definitely have lungs. The next item we would look at, the next characteristic, would be an amniotic membrane. So if you notice, salamander does not have this, the shark does not have this, but the lizard, the tiger, the gorilla, and the human all have an amniotic membrane. And so this is going to give us a way to organize these organisms based on evolutionary history and how these characteristics developed. So this very last slide for screencast number 2 is simply going to give you various sources of information. And those sources of information are going to be used to create that phylogenetic tree or that cladogram that you saw on the previous slide. So the 4 things that we would look at would be morphology, biochemistry, cytology, and of course fossils. Now when you think about morphology, I had mentioned earlier that morphology is basically form and function. You would look at the shape of the organism, you might look at the size of the organism, maybe you would even look at the development of the organism itself. In other words, maybe the life cycles that you would find in the groups that you are comparing. Now, example of maybe shape and size. If you look over here on the right hand side, you're going to notice we have a dolphin and we have a shark. Well, if you make a comparison in terms of the shape of those animals, you're definitely going to notice a similarity. So that might allow you to make some inferences as to where they should be placed in that cladogram. Now biochemistry again is another area that we could look at. It's going to analyze basically DNA, and that DNA of course is going to help us to create the amino acids that are necessary to create the proteins for those organisms. And again on the right hand side, looking at these 5 different species, you're going to notice that we have the sequence of amino acids in the same part of the hemoglobin molecule. So we're looking at the same segment of that molecule, and we compare the different amino acids. Obviously, the more that they share in common, the closer they are in evolutionary history. Now we might also look at comparative cytology. Now this is going to examine the variation in the number, maybe the shape, and maybe even the size of chromosomes in living organisms. And the last one is going to be fossils. So any information that we have gathered from our study of fossils, in other words, organisms that were present a long time ago, we might be able to use that information to sort of organize our organisms within that phylogenetic tree in a certain way relative to time. All right, so fossils can definitely be very important. All right, so that's going to finish up this second and last screencast for Chapter 10. Just a reminder, please make sure that you complete the form that's connected to this screencast before you come to class.